Thanks for tuning in to tonight's event, sponsored by the Menard Family George Washington Forum at Ohio University. Tonight's guest is Eric Nelson. He's here to have a conversation with us about justice, equity, and the religious foundations of liberalism. And you'll all have a chance to ask Eric questions. If you look at the bottom of the Zoom, there was a Q&A function. Send your questions and we'll try to get all of them before him. Eric is the Robert M. Beren Professor of Government at Harvard, where he went as an undergraduate. After that, he went to Cambridge, where he was a Marshall Scholar and where he earned his PhD. He is remarkably productive and productive of good books. He's written The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy and the American Founding, which came out in 2014, The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources, and the Transformation of European Political Thought, the Greek Tradition and Republican Thought. And he's edited Thomas Hobbes' translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey. His fourth and most recent book is The Theology of Liberalism, Political Philosophy, and the Justice of God. It's about what we'll be talking tonight. So thanks for joining us, Eric. This last book is not like your other books, right? I listed the titles of those. This is slightly different. And I guess I just wanted to begin by sort of asking, what are you trying to do? How did you come on to this? What drove you to do it? And what are you on about in the book? What are you trying to do here?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and to the George Washington Forum for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure. The how did I come to write it question has actually a boringly straightforward answer, which is that this is now, I guess, back in 2010. My friend and colleague Michael Rosen had the idea that he and Jeremy Waldron and Sam Moyne and Tamsin Shaw and I should meet in New York for an afternoon, just informally, and talk about the place of religion in contemporary political philosophy. And Jeremy had the idea that we should all read some things in common, just to get things going. And he assigned John Rawls's undergraduate senior thesis, which at that point had only just been published by my friend and colleague, Eric Gregory. Frankly, when that happened, I was annoyed because I felt, look, I mean, I've read thousands of pages of Rawls multiple times, and now I have to read the Juvenilia like he's Ovid or something. I mean, I was really not, looking forward to this. But I started to read it, and I was just riveted, and it spoke to me in several different ways. But centrally, I had always been unhappy, and I'm not alone in this unhappiness at all. I mean, this is a kind of unhappiness that goes back to the publication of The Theory of Justice in 1971 amongst his critics, with Rawls's to me, rather mysterious theory of human agency in that book. And I used to joke with my students that what you get in Rawls is secularized Augustinianism. And I just thought that was a kind of, funny thing to say about Rawls. And then I was reading this undergraduate thesis, and I thought, oh gosh, I mean, it might actually be true. And so that's really what started it. It was, trying to think seriously about the way in which certain conceptions, traditions of thought, philosophical moves in what we regard as a sort of impeccably, almost, sort of hermetically secular contemporary political theory actually began life as claims in a theological debate, and what the significance of that set of facts was for how we think about both of these disciplines, that is theology and political theory, how they relate to each other, but also more substantively how it might give us a sort of critical point of view on various sort of traditions of post-Rawlsian political philosophy and the analytic tradition in the Anglosphere in particular, but increasingly in continental Europe as well, and elsewhere where Rawls has had an enormous influence. And so that was really that was really the impetus. Yeah.
Yeah. So the book is about redistributive justice and equity and who should get what and for what reasons. But you begin in a place that is unusual, and you note it from the beginning, and you're sort of like well trained to do it. But maybe just want to get the listeners, make sure we sort of establish the ground. You quote your old friend Patrick Riley. He said that theology is political philosophy raised to a higher power, and it reminded me of the famous Carl Schmitt line that all significant concepts in modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, right? And so I just wonder, just briefly, why do you think that theology, that Christian theology, is something that we actually should that should matter to modern secular liberals?
Well, it's a great question, and Patrick Riley, I should have added as part of the story of how I came to write the book, was knowing Patrick, and then when he died very suddenly, about what is it now, 8 years ago or so, I had to take over his class, which was this sort of graduate seminar that he always gave, called Justice as Love and Benevolence, but it was very heavily focused around Leibniz and debates about theodicy. And so I had to sort of get comfortable with that material in a way that I hadn't, and that was part of the story also. So I'm glad you mentioned Patrick, who I continue to miss. And yeah, he wrote me this in a note, and I have the note, and I thought it was so fantastic that I was sure it was something famous that someone famous had said, and I was just an idiot and I didn't know who. And then I looked it up, and it turned out to be a Rileyism. I mean, this is but it's just this brilliant sort of witticism of his. And in a way, what I take him to be saying, and given in particular his work on Leibniz, it's almost the opposite of Schmittianism, right? That's to say, a Schmittian is going to say something like this, right? But usually this is, terrible caricature, but that the Schmittian imagines a kind of voluntarist God, right? Who is an arbitrary, uncontrolled sovereign, wielding, complete untrammeled authority, and then projects that notion into the political realm, where the sovereign, becomes the kind of mortal God. And it's no accident that for Schmitt and for so many people who follow in that tradition, the main figure is Hobbes, who is basically, one of maybe 2 or 3 genuine voluntarists in the 17th century. Patrick was speaking for the other side in this debate, which is to say that if you're a rationalist rather than a voluntarist, so just briefly so that we're on, because we can always use terms differently. I begin by just going back to the basics in this debate that's been going on since Plato's Euthyphro, right, about what we now call metaethics, but which is a debate about the character of morality, not about what's moral and immoral, but about what kinds of things moral principles are, right? And in the Platonic dialogue, right, which is explicitly about the pious or the holy, right? Socrates asks Euthyphro, so is something holy because the gods like it, or do the gods like it because it's holy? So, which comes first? And then, of course, you can substitute for holiness, justice, goodness, beauty, whatever. And so it's a question about value in general. And it's a question about whether these values have their origin in the will of some being, a god or we ourselves.
That's voluntarism.
Right. It would be voluntarism from the Latin term voluntas, that means the will. Or you could go the Socratic way and say, no. These values exist objectively as valid principles. They could not be otherwise in any possible world, and they're like mathematical. They're like mathematical truths. They exist sort of a priori. And God, if there is one, and he's perfect and omnibenevolent, will just unerringly conform his behavior to these principles. Well, okay, once you've said that, then you've said that in principle, God and we are playing by the same rules. Now, of course, what God has access to in terms of his empirical understanding of the world is presumably massively different from that of a finite intelligence. But the rules of justice are the same, right? And so what would be just or unjust for human beings to do in relation to other human beings, or in setting up a city, or establishing government, in punishment, in any of these other domains of life, will likewise be just or unjust for God. So what Patrick is saying is, theology is political philosophy raised to a higher power. The joke is, it's just sort of the same principles, but we're now applying them to the heavenly king, right, rather than a mortal king. But as it were, the vector is the other way around. It's moving from our understanding of the human moral realm and projecting that into the realm of divine justice. And because, and this is one of the things I'm trying to push in the book, and this is more of a point about the 17th century, the kind of 16th and 17th centuries, and into the 18th century more generally. It's that because virtually no one was a voluntarist. I mean, really, even most people, most of the people we think of as voluntarists really weren't. I mean, they're very, very few, because the bullet that you had to bite was so tough to bite, right? Because if you say, well, okay, so I think that that justice is just whatever God says it is, and then you're asked the question, well, why should I be just? What sort of answer can you be given? Well, you could be given a prudential answer, namely, well, do what he says or he'll drop a house on you or something. But you seem to not be able to give a moral reason, right? Because if you do, you're going to be arguing in a circle, right? You can't say, well, it's because God is good, because you've just defined goodness as whatever God happens to will. So this risk in the minds of most theologians, philosophers of the period we're talking about, this risk turning God into a tyrant, into a kind of arbitrary ruler, almost a kind of demonic figure. And therefore you had to sort of swim in the other direction and be a rationalist. But what that meant is that anything that you said about political theory in the terrestrial realm would cause something to come undone in the theological realm, and vice versa, right? So if you say, okay, we're going to have a debate about punishment, and I'm going to say that punishment is a right, but it's not a duty. Right? That a sovereign has the right to punish crime, but not necessarily a duty. Well, that's going to apply to God also, and is going to then get into all these different, difficult questions about why the crucifixion was necessary if God was perfectly capable, without injustice, of forgiving sin. So anything you say over here is going to cause something to come undone over there, and vice versa. And so I always think of these guys as like the guys spinning plates. It's like they're all spinning a lot at the same time, and realizing that all of it is interconnected in a way that it just wouldn't be if you were a voluntarist, right? And so that's what I think Patrick was getting at.
Okay, so you have you putting us in the right direction. So the way that that your argument works, you say liberalism began as theology. So you're giving a story of liberalism, and there's kind of a break point, and you've begun to describe sort of early modern. So the modern liberalisms that we have, and there are a variety of them,
right,
have their origins in the sort of 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And so the first, say, third of your book is about explaining that. So I just want to, very basic terms, but what is liberalism and what is theodicy, right? We're trying to understand where we came from. What are these two things?
Well, let me do the second first, because it's much easier. So because basically theodicy is the fancy name that Leibniz gave to the debate that I was just summarizing. That is the debate about God's justice. It's a neologism of Leibniz that he coins in his book, the Theodicy, in 1710. But out of the Greek words for God and justice. And the idea is it refers to a debate that arises within rationalism, right? So that once you've said, okay, so I think moral principles exist separately, independently of the will of any being, even God, and that God, therefore, if he is perfect, will always conform his behavior to these principles. But we look around and we see the world is full of evil and suffering and pain. And if we're Orthodox Christians, we think that the vast majority of the human race is going to be damned. So how is all of that consistent with the belief that an omnipotent and perfectly just being could have elected to create the world as we experience it? That's the theodicy debate. And so that's what I mean by the theodicy debate. So it's not it's part of theology, right? But it's a subset of it, right? There are lots of theological questions. This is one, and as I say, it only arises once you've accepted some premises. And so I mean, for someone like Hobbes, it's just a nonsense question. Is God just? Well, I mean, whatever, as Hobbes says at one point, whatever God does is just in virtue of his doing it. So that's the other view. Liberalism is the tough one because there's a great line. I was just teaching this text the other day, so it's fresh in my mind. But the English philosopher T.E. Hume has an essay called "The Tory Philosophy," which he wrote just before World War I, in which he says the most dangerous time to use a word is in the intermediate stage of its life, where instead of having, it starts out having one meaning and it will end up having dozens. It's the middle that's really treacherous when it has about six, because when you get to the other end, everyone has to preface the use of the term with some statement such as, what I am going to mean by the term liberalism is, and of course, this is one of these Nietzschean essentially contested terms. And it's even worse than that. To use it in relation to the early modern period is an anachronism because it's a 19th century term that's coined in the wake of the French Revolution to refer to a sort of position in French politics. So using it is necessarily to sort of flirt with a dangerous kind of anachronism. On the other hand, it's come to refer to a set of commitments that are recognizable and did indeed emerge in the period in which we're interested, right? So ideas like religious toleration, like freedom of speech, the idea of a private sphere, the idea of various kinds of sort of consent-based citizenship and so on. So this kind of cluster of ideas, which we now call liberal, are present in this period, and they have a history. Now, one of the things that I was trying to be very careful about saying is that these values were always, or these sort of institutional positions, were always the result of what you might call an overlapping consensus. That is, people defended these commitments for different reasons. But what I'm interested in, because it's usually what people mean when they talk about liberalism, is the kind of liberalism that sets out from what I call dignitarianism, right? From the idea that that there are constraints on how we can treat human beings because they have a particular kind of transcendent value insofar as they're capable of autonomous choice, and that coercing them and sort of living their lives for them is therefore a particular kind of wrong, and so that's the tradition that I'm focused on, not least because it's the tradition that all of these contemporary philosophers think they're continuing, and so it's the one that I focus on. But as I say, There are any number of routes to these commitments, and it's not the only one.
So you have part of the argument in the book is that the if we want to say the main proto-strand, right, of liberalism is one associated with a heretical Christian theological tradition called Pelagianism.
Yep.
And that Rawls rejected Pelagianism. So could you just explain to people who might not know who Pelagius or even Augustine, who is, basically what are the differences between these Pelagianism and Augustinianism, and why does that matter for helping us understand Rawls and from Rawls modern liberalism?
Okay, well, so actually, as often with these kind of tedious terms, it's pretty simple. It has complicated ramifications, but it's easy to state as a kind of general principle. And let's just pick up the dialectic where we left it off. So now you've said, so remember, we're in our theodicy debate, and you say, right, so how is all of the evil that we experience in the world consistent with the hypothesis that an omnipotent and perfectly just God could have elected to create the world? Well, one thing that you're going to focus on immediately is the question of God's punitive justice. That is, the justice of his punishing us for our sins. And if you're in the sort of grip of this theodicy debate, one of the first things that you're probably going to want to say, by way of attempting to vindicate God's justice, is that human beings are transcendently and metaphysically free. Right? That is, that what makes it just, and the only thing that could make it just for God to punish me when I sin, is if I could not sin. Right? If I have it within my power not to sin. If I'm, as it were, programmed like a computer to sin, then it would be tyrannical for God to punish me, because he's punishing me for something I couldn't but do, right? So on pain of his punishment being unjust, and depending on your point of view, also his rewards, although there's a separate debate about that, then it must be the case that we possess this transcendent freedom, right? That we stand outside the order of the natural world with its laws of causation, and in some way that's mysterious, that we can never prove, but we have to infer from the justice of God. We have to suppose that we're free and always capable of not sinning. And moreover, you might go further and say, well, this is actually going to vindicate God a second way. Because even once we've gotten rid of God, the problem of his punitive justice, because we've said we're free and therefore responsible for our sins, what about all of the natural evils that exist in the world? Earthquakes, cancer. Why would a just God have allowed all of this to exist? To which the answer that you might flirt with is something like the following. Well, again, it's not something we could ever show, because our intelligence and our ability to cognize the world is just intrinsically limited. But we can infer from God's justice that in order for there to be something of transcendent value in the world, namely human beings who are capable of morality, there had to be all of these bad things. That it's sort of part of the recipe, right? No earthquakes, no human beings capable of morality. Now, we don't know how that works, and we could never prove it because we can't fathom the sort of rival possible worlds, right? But it's an inference from God's justice. And so now you've also said, you've given an explanation for why a just God would permit a certain amount of evil if it were a necessary condition for bringing about a world in which human beings capable of morality, which is the thing that's transcendently valuable, could exist. So everything that I've just said, let's just call Pelagianism, right? It's named for this 4th century Roman British monk, Pelagius, about whom we know very, very little, and about whom early modern people knew even less. And this is very important because we now actually have a lot more information about Pelagius than we used to, and a number of his works that were not extant in the early modern period now are. But Pelagianism, to the extent that it's an ism, is something we have to think about separate and apart from what Pelagius himself wrote, said. It's really, most people were getting their Pelagius through Augustine, because Augustine wrote works attacking Pelagius, in the context of which he quoted large chunks of Pelagius's writing. So basically what Pelagianism, for our purposes, is the view that on pain of God being unjust, right, in both his punitive justice and his creative justice, or his distributive justice, it must be the case that that human beings are always free to cultivate themselves, to become virtuous, and thereby merit election. And that the role of grace in all of this, although Pelagius himself never wanted to say that it was zero, he redefined grace in various ways as to make it effectively zero from the point of view of a more orthodox understanding of grace. Right? Now, the problem, as probably people can guess, is that might seem like a promising strategy for shoring up the sort of rationalist end of the theodicy debate. But it seemed to contemporaries, not least Augustine, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, that it was obviously incompatible with Christian doctrine. Because if you really believe that human beings are always perfectly capable of avoiding sin on their own power, as it were, then why did we need the crucifixion, the atonement? Why did Jesus have to sacrifice himself for us? And then what is the role of grace? And so, to sort of sharpen this rejection of Pelagian ideas, Augustine doubles down in his late works on his sort of mature doctrine of original sin, the idea that the fall produced a fundamental depravity in human nature that is unhealed, that we are radically unfree, that we're slaves to sin, that we're in the bondage of sin, and of course in his late anti-Pelagian works, Augustine really becomes a double predestinarian. That's to say, he really believes that that all that can save is grace, and that grace comes irresistibly and inscrutably to those God has foreordained to receive it. And once they've received it, they will be elect, and everyone else will not be. And of course, Augustine thought that number was very small. So those are basically the two views.
Yeah. Okay. And so perfect. Rawls, right? Skip forward to the 20th century from the 4th, just a little bit of time.
Yeah, just a little hop, skip, and a jump. Yeah.
Just a millennium and change.
Yeah.
And a half. But Rawls, on your thing, is himself, at least the young Rawls, the Rawls you're sitting in New York with Moyne and Shaw, et cetera, reading, is no fan of Pelagianism. And so these early liberals are Pelagian.
He's no fan. I mean, so you talk about the bit in the middle. Well, the bit in the middle includes people defending versions of this position like Milton, like John Locke, and most interestingly from this point of view, Kant. And so, from the point of view of someone who'd only read Rawls, the sort of mature Rawls, and knew nothing, as most people simply did not, including myself, obviously. Up until about 10 years ago, we really knew nothing about Rawls before his very early philosophical articles. And we only knew what he said about himself and his philosophy. And that is, Rawls, when he's writing the theory of justice, is offering this as a liberal theory, straightforwardly, as a liberal theory, and as a continuation of Kantianism, right? So as a kind of reconceptualization of the Kantian project, where the idea of the categorical imperative is replaced by the original position, basically, right? Giving you his particular understanding, which is quite idiosyncratic, of Kant's moral philosophy and what makes it distinctive. And so, you think of Rawls as a Kantian and a liberal, and yet that always bothered me because he was so obviously un-Kantian in lots of sort of obvious ways. and not least in his understanding of agency, because Rawls in the Theory of Justice makes this famous claim. And he makes it very briefly. I mean, it's one of the sort of persistent annoyances of that very great book, that the stuff you really don't need a lot of information about, like Pareto optimality, you get 50 pages on, and the little stuff like the priority of liberty, or or moral arbitrariness, you get 3 paragraphs sprinkled across 400 pages, and you then have to try to reconstruct what he's talking about. So this is one of those, but it's absolutely central to his argument, although people have disagreed about exactly how or what role it plays in the argument. But it's an argument about distributive justice that goes like this. So Rawls thinks of society as a scheme of social cooperation. And the question therefore arises, how should the fruits of our cooperation, that which is produced as a result of it, how should it be distributed? One view you might have is that people who produce more should get more, basically. People who are responsible for the creation of more value should get a larger share of the pie. And this is actually a view that was also interestingly appealing to people on the far left, insofar as it is closely related to the labor theory of value, right? That people, what you put in is what you should get out. And Rawls says no. He says no, because all of the facts about so if Professor Ingram and I are engaged in social cooperation and production, and he produces much more than I do or adds much more value, then this will be, Rawls says, because of a set of facts about him that are arbitrary from a moral point of view, meaning that what he does should be understood as the joint product of his heredity and environment, sort of his genes and upbringing. That will include how smart he is, how talented, but also things like how industrious, how hardworking, how committed, and disciplined he is. All of this is beyond his control. And the fact that I'm a little dumber and not as talented and rather lazy is also not to my demerit, because that's equally true. That's equally the function of factors about me that are beyond my control, my family upbringing, my genetics, and so on. So because no one can claim any credit or merit for the additional value that they end up producing, the social product should be presumptively divided equally, unless we can show, famously, that an unequal division would make the least well-off people better off than they would be under unequal division. And it becomes more sort of Baroque from there. But that's plenty for now. So it's a very skeptical picture of human agency, right? It's a very deterministic picture, and it comes with this wrinkle that people, right from the very beginning, whether Robert Nozick or Michael Sandel, all of the people who were his initial interlocutors and critics in the 1970s and early 80s, pointed this out, that there was this odd asymmetry. Because on the one hand, he makes this argument about production and the impossibility of desert within it. But on the other hand, when it comes to punitive justice, when it comes to punishing people who've committed crimes, he says moral arbitrariness doesn't apply. We don't say, well, okay, it's not his fault he held up a bank, it's his parents' fault or his genetics or some combination thereof. We say it's really him, right? And he's done a naturally bad act for which he's responsible. And so not only do you have this very sort of pessimistic picture of human agency on the productive distributive justice side, but you seem to have the opposite one doing work in the realm of punishment, the theory of punishment and punitive justice. And so there's been all of the, many people trying to explain this and trying to make it fit together. And, my own view is that it just doesn't, and there's no way to make it go. That's at all philosophically coherent. And the thing that just struck me was that when you read the young Rawls, and Rawls, at this point is an undergraduate at Princeton. He's studying theology, right, not political philosophy. And he's writing his thesis on neo-Orthodox Christian theology. And he writes this very long thesis called Brief Inquiry on the Meaning of Sin and Faith, in which it's a complicated text and it's fascinating, but one of the major projects is an attack on Pelagianism. And an attack on the possibility of merit. That is to say, the idea that if you think that human beings can be meritorious on their own, if you think that we can act freely of our own volition in such a way as to then acquire a claim on God's favor, Christianity collapses. As he says, Pelagius would turn the cross of Christ upside down. And so you get this full-throttled rejection of the possibility of merit. That is, in this context, fully sort of expressed in the idiom of a theological debate about Christian topics in theology, like justification, sanctification, and all the rest. But he has the same asymmetry here. But here, it's just the doctrine of original sin. That's to say, what he says, as Augustine says, is that because is that the thing about us that's sort of basic and mysterious is that we're sinners, and our sin is uncaused in some mysterious way. It doesn't come from outside us. As Augustine says, it's the spirit depraving itself, turning in on itself, and corrupting itself, and it's not caused from outside. So we're really responsible for our sins. Our sins really should be attributed to us, because the being who's sinning is really we ourselves. But what then needs to be explained from outside, as it were, is our good actions. Why would a being like this ever do anything good? And the answer to that question is grace. Right. So grace comes from outside, and because it comes from outside, we can claim no credit in it. Therefore, it must come in this sort of inscrutable way, and we must depend on it utterly, or else the sort of Christian salvific scheme, as the young Rawls understands it, falls apart. So here you had exactly the same pair of arguments in exactly the same terminology, in exactly but here they make sense. They make a very controversial sort of sense, but they make sense as a statement of what begins as a recognizable position in Christian theology. But what happens in the theory of justice after Rawls, no longer thinks or writes this way. That's to say, he no longer thinks of himself as participating in a theological debate, no longer thinks of himself, perhaps, although it's an open question in the 70s, as a Christian at all, and certainly not an Orthodox one. So he's doing a very different kind of project, and his views about religion have changed enormously, but he continues to have this basic orientation on issues of agency. And of course, one of the other things that's so fascinating about that text is that the young Rawls really didn't like Kant, precisely because Kant is a Pelagian. And so anyway, that's what really struck me.
So So the young Rawls, the Rawls of Princeton, who's writing this precocious thesis, is thinking about being an Episcopal priest, is grappling with these, grappling with these issues.
And then he goes off to fight in the war in the Pacific, and that sort of redirects his life.
Kind of comes back, and he rejects, seems like, Christian belief, but keeps the habits of mind and keeps the view of human nature. And as you said, he secularizes these theological concepts. And as I understand your book, you seem to be arguing the entirety of modern liberalism is really just a secularized version of early modern Christian influenced forms of liberalism. And you seem to be saying that something's lost in the process, right? Is that a fair enough?
Yeah, it's or rather what I'm and I hope you won't think it's a kind of pedantic distinction. It's not that I think that there are inherently religious arguments or positions that that have been replaced with secular ones. It's that this whole religious secular distinction, when it comes to questions like the ones we're discussing, is itself the problem, right? That's to say that unless you're a voluntarist in the early modern period, these positions about agency, the conditions for responsibility, the conditions for legitimate punishment, distributive justice, justice in creation, all of that stuff, none of that, you can have that debate even if you think there's no God, right? And that was also one of the bullets that rationalists had to bite. It's why Grotius famously says, if you take this path, and it's the path he takes, then these things would all be true even if there were no God, right? Because what you're talking about now is a set of moral principles, and what you're asking is, how do they apply to different situations and cases, to the extent that we can make sense of them at all? And so initially, this debate about agency and metaphysical freedom of the will was part of a debate about divine election, right? But there's nothing inherently religious about the question about the freedom of the will, right? I mean, this is a question that you're also interested in if you're a non-theist who holds strongly deontic views about ethics or whatever. So in a way, that's what I'm saying, that what we missed is the fact that these same debates that contemporary philosophers in the liberal tradition think they're having for the first time were actually being had, for 4 centuries at frankly a much higher level of sophistication, because they had they were further along in the dialectic, when it comes to all of these questions about how whether the unequal, just to take another example that I deal with, the kind of view that comes out of one branch of this tradition of thinking about moral arbitrariness is the view that is called luck egalitarianism, right? This idea that that basically there's something unjust about the fact that people possess different amounts of advantage that are unchosen. So, again, it's not just that if you're using your superior talents to get a larger share of the social product is the problem. You're having the superior talents is itself unjust, and you might, in principle, right, be required to compensate me for the injustice. Well, that debate about whether it is just or unjust for some people to have a higher level of talent or health or whatever than other people, and whether that distribution is consistent with the hypothesis that a just being could have brought it about, just was half of the theodicy debate. And very smart people argued very intelligently about it for a long time, and avoided a lot of the mistakes that I think the contemporary theorists get themselves into.
Yeah. So the mistakes I want to come to in a bit. So just to make clear, the issues you're talking about, like words like distributive justice, and you're talking about how much stuff people have, right? Is it to put this in I was thinking when you're doing this, like Bernie Madoff, that day. So Rawls might say Bernie Madoff deserved to go to jail. That was a crime for which he deserved, but Jamie Dimon doesn't deserve the amount of he has committed no crime, but he doesn't deserve it because of his innate of intellectual abilities or whatever it is that that would help him have made his money, illegally. So these are not. Should someone be, debates we have today about should someone be held responsible for violating a law? Mm-hmm. These are all salient issues that exist in every society, and that exist in ours, and that liberalism, for better or for worse, is the language that we speak, or varieties of it that come out of Rawls. You seem to have a problem with it, right? So one of the interesting things about the book is you get to kind of the last third of the book, you deal with luck egalitarians and institutional egalitarians and left and right, which are called left and right libertarians. And all of these you find wanting, right? You think that this is I read you seem to think that the prescriptions they have for redistributing the goods of society just don't hold up to sort of rational analysis. And I guess I just wondered, why is that? These are very smart people, right? Writing, and you clearly have a lot of respect, right, for a lot of them, but you think they're wrong. And so I guess I just wonder, what is wrong about most forms of modern egalitarianism in your view?
Well, so a couple of things that I want to clarify. One is that I'm just looking at the arguments that have been offered for various kinds of egalitarianism or redistribution, right? And I find that the family of arguments that I'm talking about in this book don't go through. That is, they simply don't successfully get to that conclusion from their premises. And so, now part of the issue is to set up dilemmas, right? Because, again, if you are operating within this tradition of dignitarian liberalism, right? The whole point of all of this, if you're a Rawlsian, is to say that that people ought to be autonomous, capable of selecting a comprehensive conception of the good. They ought to, we ought to regard them this way. And this idea of really foregrounding the importance of autonomy and choice is a commitment that this group of theorists has not relinquished, right? So one of the things one of the ways that the book proceeds is just to say, well, look, if you want to keep this, right, you can't keep this partly, right? That is to say, you don't get to use one theory of agency in one domain and another theory of agency in the other, right? Now, again, there are some contemporary egalitarians who are pretty willing to bite the bullet and just sort of be full-on compatibilists in the sense, someone like Tim Scanlon, my colleague here, who would say something like, well, look, I don't think that any idea of sort of freedom of the will is necessary in order to vindicate the kind of freedom that liberalism is interested in and the kinds of moral judgments about things like blameworthiness, responsibility, and all the rest that we're interested in. I think we can have all of that without the kind of metaphysics of the free will. Now that's a big bullet to bite, but but some are willing to bite it. But most are not. So so part of it is just to say, look, if you want to hold this, you can't also hold this. So that's one of the things. Sometimes, it's just as in the case of the Rawlsian point about agency that I was sketching out. I hope that showing genealogically how it developed shows what you would need to hold in order to make it tick, right? Or you would need to come up with something else, right? So basically, I think that this kind of work is supposed to set up a particular kind of choice situation for the philosopher who holds the position, right? You can either say, oh, and relinquish the position, Or you can accept Rawls's initial premises, which is an unattractive thought for most of them, or you could try to come up with an alternative, something else, some other foundation that you could build in for this building to stand on. And I think that's the right debate to be had. Can you do that? I don't see how you can, but this is the very beginnings of the debate, and I'm totally persuadable. So, but to the extent that all of these different strands are predicated upon these strong arguments about moral arbitrariness and the arbitrary and therefore unjust or unfair character of the existing distribution of advantage, I think they run into just insuperable metaphysical problems that people like Leibniz had fully diagnosed, centuries before. For instance, and that appear in much more familiar guise in other areas of moral philosophy. So, for instance, I don't know if some of your listeners will probably be familiar with this thing called the non-identity problem, and the name was given to it by Derek Parfit, the sort of famous late Oxford moral philosopher. And I think that Parfit thought that he had invented this problem. And basically, it's the thought that wrongdoing, let's say, brings it about not just that people are harmed, but that different sets of people will exist from the set of people who would have existed had the injustice not taken place, right? This is a common sort of conceptual tool to use now in debates about things like climate change and genetics and bioethics and all of this other stuff. He's very interested in these questions of the ethics of when to have a child, and if you think that a child might be at risk of being damaged if you have it at a particular time. This is germane to all of those questions. It's also obviously germane to this issue about the distribution of advantages and this question of whether compensation is owed from you to me, right? Because and this was again fully understood in the 18th century that if my complaint is that it's unjust that a situation has arisen either because there was a creator who brought it about or just by evolutionary chance, that you have a larger bundle of natural abilities and talents, or you're smarter than I am, then I demand compensation. The non-identity problem is going to say, wait, hang on. If the distributor, right, had actually equalized the share of abilities and aptitudes between us, I wouldn't exist and neither would you, right? We would then be talking about two different people, right? So actually the injustice is a condition of my existing, right? So if I say I want to be compensated for the fact that I didn't get the complement of natural abilities that a just distributor should have given to some other being who is not me, that becomes a much more complicated claim. Right. So that's just another example. Yeah. So
on your view, then, if you think the egalitarians, like as you say, there's a problem in the code, right? There's a metaphysical problem. So should liberal societies be inegalitarian? Should they be? Not they are, right, as a matter of just sort of lived experience, but should they be? In your views, as we kind of move to the sort of thinking, well, what might a solution to some of these problems be? That would seem to be one you'd have to address, right?
No, what I say at the end is that I don't think that this argument forecloses the possibility of permissible redistribution. I just think that if these arguments are correct, it's the case that redistribution isn't required by justice in most cases. Whether redistribution is permissible is a completely separate matter And I think the answer to that question is obviously yes, for all kinds of reasons, which I can get into. And I think there are all kinds of reasons we might collectively have to decide to do things like mitigate inequality, not least because we might take the view that extremely large levels of it, high levels of it, are simply unsustainable in societies like ours over time. And so, very strong prudential reasons. We might also have moral reasons that are not reasons of justice, right? That's to say, the same reason that we have moral reasons to give charity, that we have moral reason to help others if we can do so, if they're suffering, and the doing so doesn't cause any significant disadvantage to ourselves. But those aren't reasons of justice. That's to say that I think this whole discussion has to move out of the justice terrain, where I think it's been bogged down for a very long time.
What sort of? I was trying to think of some as I was reading at the end. You end with hey, recover the theodicy debate. It shows if we think about the theodicy debate, you say it's allowed us to see that the principle of justice doesn't settle the question of distribution one way or another.
That's right.
It's up to us. And so I guess I was trying to think, well, what are some of the standards that us could judge by? One of the things that I was thinking was, a colleague of yours, or at least the fellow employee at Harvard in the law school, Adrian Vermeule and others, right, or thinking about common good constitutionalism,
right,
and knowing that there are differences of what the common good, what people think the common good might be, but sort of beginning with that Thomistic notion that law, I think as Aquinas says, is an ordinance of human reason for the common good, promulgated by the one who's in charge of the community. So I guess as you think of various options other than the kind of modern egalitarianism that is a kind of offspring of Rawlsian liberalism, what do you think of something like the common good, or are there other kind of ways of conceiving of how we should live together, standards that you think are ones that are worth more exploration?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I'm trying, particularly in the context of this book, but I should, I guess, put my cards on the table more generally and just say I'm a liberal. In the sense that I am very drawn to the tradition of liberal thought that Rawlsianism supplanted, which takes very seriously the significance of agency and choice, and the distinctive value that the capacity for morality confers on human beings, and therefore the sort of reasons we have to be respectful of it. And so I'm not a common good. So to the extent that what Adrian is doing is something quite self-consciously illiberal, or rather anti-liberal, moving away from liberalism to a kind of state philosophy, right? I'm with Milton and Locke and Kant and the others on why not to do that. Namely, that it violates this particular transcendent dignity of persons, and so that's not a kind of that's not the kind of view that I'm drawn to, and so. Again, but you're right, because just to say, the point of the book is to look at liberalism, and as you pointed out at the beginning, not liberalism of any kind, liberalism of one kind, right? The kind that I would say interests most people in the kind of contemporary philosophical world, this kind of dignitarian, kind of autonomy-based liberalism. But your question about whether redistribution can be whether it's a requirement of justice or whether it can be permissible and so on. This is a debate that you can have in the context of any number of kind of different sort of stacks of premises that run the gamut from differently liberal, or liberal in a different sense, to completely illiberal, right? And so the terrain is very broad, right? So we could talk, for instance, just to be a little more specific, we could talk about a different kind of liberalism, which is entirely recognizable, and we could do a genealogy of it just as easily as a genealogy of this one, that actually takes a particular Augustinian conception of fallenness as foundational, right? This is a kind of liberalism that says, precisely because human beings are depraved and in the bondage of sin and can't be trusted with each other, we should be very wary of giving excessive power to anyone, and we should institute things like the rule of law and freedom of conscience and other things, but for completely different reasons.
It's sort of like Actonian,
or Niebuhrian, or frankly, and again, that's a kind of liberalism, but it's also very attractive to particular kinds of conservatives who share that preconception and make common cause with liberals on at least some set of issues. And thinking of someone like Michael Oakeshott, who absolutely begins from that. This idea of irreconcilable conflict and the intrinsic the intrinsically limited character of human nature that requires umpiring, is his term, right? That's already a completely different tradition. But of course the point is that all these contemporary analytic liberals don't think that they're Niebuhrians. They do think they're Kantians of a kind, and that's the problem. Right.
So there's a follow up on that in just a sec, but a question in the Q&A. One of the listeners says he's skeptical of your account. He says, does Rawls's liberalism really rise and fall in this account? Meaning, isn't his concern with what will lead to successful continuing social cooperation among free individuals, despite a diversity of beliefs and values? And doesn't his concern with redistribution stem from this concern?
As some people might know, there's been a huge debate amongst Rawlsians, or kind of self-described Rawlsians, or people influenced by Rawls, about the role of the set of arguments I'm talking about in the theory. Right. One view is the one taken by a number of luck egalitarians, which said that actually Rawls, the theory of justice, is sort of about rectifying moral arbitrariness, that the moral arbitrariness argument is absolutely at the center of the project, and the project is about rectification of unfairness and injustice that's given in as a result of the differential abilities and sort of situations of people. That's the minority view. The majority view is much more like the view, I think, being argued for by the person who posed the very good question. And this view says, no. Moral arbitrary, what Rawls is doing is trying to come up with a vision of a society of free and equal people engaged in a process of social cooperation, and that this vision of a society of free and equal people is the ground, is the project, right? And what he's doing is asking what would be the necessary sort of social arrangements, or what form would the basic structure have to take in order to allow a society of this kind to take shape. And you then think that it will require something like the difference principle, and you go from there. Then where does moral arbitrariness come in? Well, it comes in by way of rebutting a particular objection, right, to the distributive principles that have been embedded in the theory so as to create this society of free and equal social cooperators. Namely, what about desert? right? What about the fact that people who work hard or contribute more should get more? What do you say to that, Rawls? And then Rawls is giving you a response in these passages about moral arbitrariness by way of trying to rebut that potential objection. What I try to say in the book is that this matters either way, because obviously for the first group, the smaller group, but still very influential insofar as that line of thought kind of turns into like egalitarianism, and people like Jerry Cohen, the question of whether the moral arbitrariness argument works is absolutely central, right? I mean, that's the whole point. But even if you're in the second camp and what you say is no, it's not central, but it's what Rawls has to say by way of rebutting the argument from desert or merit or whatever you want to call it. If that argument fails, of course, you need to substitute something else. And then the question is, what's the something else? And can Rawls coherently rebut that objection, given the other premises that he has and the other commitments that he has in the theory? And so that's, the question is a very good one, and it invites a much longer discussion. But that's basically how I think about it.
So there's another. When you were speaking, someone else wrote in, and it's a sort of three-parter, but it works together. And I just wonder, what you think about it. So the question, or the three tied together question, goes something like this: Is racism a natural endowment? And the person says, is white supremacy natural? If no, right? If it isn't, do you agree with Charles Mills, who says that white supremacy is like an organizing principle of liberalism, and that consent really means was early on just defined as of and only white Europeans, and then does justice require distribution for racism, right? So, I mean, the argument or the questioner seems to want to know, is liberalism really a kind of neutral set of just a kind of neutral set of rules that helps us judge anybody? Or Professor Nelson, the historian who's thinking about liberalism historically, is there something about the lived experience of liberalism in the 17th and 18th century, particularly with regard to race, that we should be taking into account now? I think that's what the questioner is trying to get at.
Well, there's a huge amount in that. I mean, the first question is, should racism, or take racism as a kind of hateful belief that causes people to commit injustice, should that be considered something given, that just the sort of cards that were dealt by some combination of heredity and environment, such that people who are racists aren't responsible for racist actions? This is or can't be blamed for them in a particular sense. To me, it's one of the disturbing consequences of the theory of agency I'm rejecting, that it would seem to invite that kind of that kind of exculpatory view, right? To say, well, what did you want from the Klansman in the 20s? He was a Klansman in the 20s. I mean, he was it's sort of just the cards he was dealt. I don't like that way of proceeding. I want to blame the Klansman in the 20s for being a Klansman in the 20s. Now, the last chapter of the book is about the difficulties of this, because obviously, when we're talking about issues of historical injustice and blameworthiness, what we're going to think about is going to depend on what period of time we're talking about, and whether we accept all kinds of other controversial views about. For instance, if you think that morality, as Locke thinks, or various others, Derek Parfit, if you think that morality is something like natural sciences that we get better at over time, that we're learning about. Then you seem to have some reason not for denying that particular kinds of wrongdoing in the past. Let's say I give the example in the book of the Hittite who owned slaves, right, in the Bronze Age. There's a particular kind of theorist who's a relativist who wants to say it wasn't wrong for the Hittite to own slaves in the Bronze Age, but it would be wrong now. I'm not a relativist. So what I want to say is, no, it was wrong for the Hittite to own slaves, even in the Bronze Age. However, there seems to be something slightly weird about saying we should blame the Hittite for owning slaves, given that it's virtually impossible for a Hittite to have recognized the injustice of the institution of slavery if you have this kind of progressive conception of morality, since, for instance, the institution of slavery was accepted as basically legitimate in every ancient text, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Christian gospel, and name it, right? And the injustice of slavery as an institution per se is not really even mooted as a serious argument until the very end of the 17th century, and then beginning in the 18th century, and usually with lots of provisos and things. So yes, I mean, those become very interesting arguments. But no, the whole point of my story is to say I don't want to treat wrongdoing and the pernicious sort of beliefs that people acquire that lead to these actions as arbitrary from a moral point of view. I want to treat people as responsible for their actions and for the cultivation of the beliefs under which they act. That's to say, if you hold racist beliefs, it's probably because you allowed yourself to exist in a milieu became dependent on news sources that would predictably cause you to acquire such beliefs, or that you were negligent in determining where you were to get your news or whatever. I would want to hold you responsible for this kind of belief formation and the actions that you take under it. The question about I really only dealt with question 1. Questions 2 and 3 are really, if question 2 is pointing to the fact, which is undeniable, that a great deal of what we in retrospect regard as formative liberal political theory was developed in the 17th century, which also was the age of the beginnings of empire, the slave trade, and that many of the theorists in question, whether we're talking about Hobbes or Locke, were themselves actually active participants in colonial ventures. And Hobbes was a shareholder in the First Virginia Company, and Locke was a proprietor of the Carolina colony. And our ideas about slavery and freedom deeply sort of embedded in that context in all kinds of complicated ways? Yes, absolutely. But I also don't think that they reduce to simple ideological defenses of colonialism or enslavement. It's my own.
Back to one could indeed point back to these debates earlier on in your book about sin and what's to blame and human nature, right? Seem to be so. To get us out of here on this, aside from your book, you want the people who listen to this or watch the video later, you can say, look, here are 3 good books that I think you should read, that I think would help you frame the issue, to think about these issues of distribution and what kind of how we should relate to other. What would they be? What would be things that you would recommend?
It's really hard. It depends which piece of this. I mean, obviously, for people who haven't read Rawls, the undergraduate thesis and Rawls himself, I think it's very important. And then the sort of the really interesting and independently significant critiques of Rawls by people like Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State and Utopia, or or Jerry Cohen in Rescuing Justice and Equality, or people like Amartya Sen. I mean, there's tons of interesting stuff of that kind. But if you're interested in this question of how to think about the relationship between the political, between political philosophy and theology, then I would certainly point people toward Patrick Riley's book, which is called Leibniz's Universal Jurisprudence, which is not a sexy title, but it's a really scholarly and very careful book that really explains how Leibnizian ideas about theology and theodicy go along with his particular kind of Platonism. There's another book that I think is very good if you're interested in the sort of English 17th century side of this, which is by Sarah Mortimer at Oxford, that's called Reason and Religion in the English Revolution, which looks at the way in which these debates about punishment and things like that sort of just passed through the porous boundary separating debates in political theory proper from debates in theology. So I think those are all good choices. And as a plug, my colleague Michael Rosen is finishing a book on Kant's moral philosophy that's called The Shadow of God, which hopefully will come out next year. And in it, he launches a really cogent and, to my mind, persuasive sort of attack on the way that that people in the broadly sort of Harvard Oxford Rawlsian tradition have interpreted Kant. And so it's a really interesting reconstruction of Kant's moral philosophy, which takes seriously his religious thought in a way that I think hasn't been done in quite a while.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, we appreciate your time. I appreciate the time of all those who tuned in, and thank you for coming on tonight. For those interested in Eric's book, it's the Theology of Liberalism, Political Philosophy, and the Justice of God, available at fine bookstores near you. The next Menard Family George Washington event will be next Wednesday night, the 21st of April, when Henry Now from George Washington University will discuss conservative internationalism. In the meantime, thanks very much, Eric, for joining us tonight.